Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here. Just before starting out today's Q&A, I had to re-upload Price of Peace episode of Battlespace just in order to fix the audio. It's annoying that YouTube doesn't just allow you to do that online anymore. It's a bit of a pain in the buttski. In any case, it's been re-uploaded, as many of you will have known. And I would just ask you guys, if you watch the first upload, watch the re-upload. I think you'll find a massive improvement, but also just share it around or rewatch it anyway, just to make sure that all the kind of the broader fan base is able to sort of see it and find it, because there's a good I have 5,000 of you guys, but there's a good another 10,000 who aren't subscribed. They really should subscribe, but I'm sure they want to see it, and it's easier. It'll be easier for people to find in the old algorithm if people are still watching it. So I'd appreciate any help you can give it, or just share it around, whatever. Anyway, let's get back into the Q&A. So, part 3, or episode 3, the Price of Peace. Not the Price of Peace. Starfleet Under Siege. Now, this was the episode where I beansed it on controversy. And I think people realised it and realised what I really wanted to address in this particular conflict. So, I mean, the first part of that is the meaning of victory. It means a lot of different things. It's like a lot of people in the comments of previous episodes were saying, well, why doesn't Starfleet just demolish the Cardassian fleet, destroy all their shipyards, and they win, surely? And it's like, it's not as complicated as that. A, they'd have to admit they were at war, which they don't want to do. B, I don't think that would win the war for them. And I think it's important to understand it's like cultural contact between the two, and it's like, as far as the Cardassians are concerned, the Federation are like the incarnate of evil, because they're basically like the old Hibishian way, which was so ruinous for them. They don't want to get seduced back into it again. All the people in power of the generation that rebelled against the old ways, so they don't want to go back to it. But it is definitely something that's in the Cardassian psyche, which is why it becomes, Cardassia might join the Federation later on. That's definitely talked about. The other issue that kind of comes up is the means to peace, and that kind of is rolled in with the issue of hawks and doves. The hawk, Jellicoe, he actually does quite a good job of getting a peace process going, and he does it by being very hawkish, very aggressive, and seemingly very jingoistic. But it works, and the Cardassians surrender to him, and I think that's consistent with his character, and I think it's also consistent with the Cardassians' character. Like I say, they're highly conscious of their own military insecurities, and that's really just talking about, sometimes the best people for peace are the hawks. I mean, I won't talk about current US presidents, although I think he is actually an example of this, but certainly even if you want to go back to the Cold War, well, particularly starting with Eisenhower. I mean, Eisenhower was a Republican, and he was an ex-general, and he was quite of the hawkish persuasion. But under him, they saw a de-escalation. You want to go further, let's talk about Tricky Dicky, as we call him in Britain, or Richard Nixon. And of course, there's other things he did, which are maybe not so good. But in terms of peace, that was Henry Kissinger. He had as his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, and the whole thing was that was the classic good cop, bad cop, because, Nixon stood on this whole, hardline anti-communist, stop the Red Menace kind of platform, and, he'd go in there, very much sort of guns blazing, and, people already had that aura of him of, okay, yeah, this guy is a complete wacko. He really is just completely unreasonable and crazy. And he'd be and so he'd publicly be that, and then you'd have Kissinger saying, look, this guy is complete nutcase. If we want to stop nuclear war, let's just, reasonable men, let's just work this out. He'd probably have more of an accent in the way he said it, but point stands. the misconception Starfleet have is that the way you ascertain peace is act dovish. Now, sometimes that does work, particularly if the other side are doves. But if the other side aren't, then that's not a good way of securing peace. And I think that's also a thing, is a misreading of each other's intentions and boundaries. So, like, for example, you want to talk about that, you talk about World War II, and German Chancellor, I won't say his name because demonetization, but the German Chancellor, he was quite convinced that because we hadn't responded to the invasions of Czechoslovakia, Austria, he was like, well, I'm going to take Poland. I mean, then they didn't care about that. They're not going to care about this. I can get away with it. And, you know, he had every reason to think he could get away with it. And that was a sort of an undeclared line in the sand that the Allies had. And then he crossed it. And then he was surprised when they were actually, yeah, okay, we actually are going to, you know, step in this time. And that came from a misreading of intentions. And that's often what is, unfortunately, at the root of many conflicts, is people lying about what they are and aren't willing to concede. And that brings us to really then the whole idea of saints in paradise. And, you know, talking about, you know, there you have the real difference between Federation and Cardassians, and it comes in with the whole internment scandal. And, you know, people have pointed out, and I'll get onto that in a second, how there might have been foul play with that, and I'll talk about that. But just in terms of, you know, Nechayev cuts off communications with the rest of the Federation because they don't know, but it's because they can't understand. It's like they'd be getting they have a very skewed perspective of everything because they're sitting in a very luxurious core worlds with everything provided for them, and the colonists aren't. And it's part of why they struggle to understand the Cardassians and make an accommodation or peace with them, is because they don't get that the Cardassians don't, you know, the top brass don't understand that the Cardassians aren't in paradise and aren't going to see the world in the way they do. So that really brings us to the question of who are the Cardassians. This was an interesting topic of conversation that some people had in the comments. Is, you know, everyone said, well, you know, the typical comparison with the Cardassians is with Germany during World War II. And not unreasonably, I think the original intention was somewhat along those lines. Certainly with the Bajoran occupation, that is definitely a reference to the Shoah. But it's one way of portraying it, and actually I think the Bajoran occupation, while the original intention might have been as a parallel to the Shoah, it's not really similar. It's a lot more similar to other kinds of genocides and massacres that were almost less organized. The thing with the Bajoran occupation is, like, half of it was just done out of brutality and incompetence, and that's I could do a whole video talking about that and how the show was very, very different. It would be demonetized, so I won't get into it now, but the other people were like, well, actually, I saw two people say that it was like Imperial Japan, which I get, yeah, and sort of very resource strapped. There's also that kind of, you know, they've somewhat proved themselves already. They've got a newfound confidence. I think perhaps definitely by the time of the Dominion War, more so. Equally, I quite like the comparison with Mussolini's Italy, just in terms of their incompetence. I know it's a bit of a meme, but I really like the relations, particularly between the Cardassia and the Dominion. Like, that is absolutely World War II Germany and Italy, like, in a nutshell. It's the same thing. And when I do my Dominion War episodes, I am going to absolutely harp on that as a theme, because I think it's quite amusing, and you can definitely see it. But this gets to the real crux of the issue, which is that the Cardassians really are underdogs in this war. Another one. So some people ask me about the music that I used for the Cardassians, and why did I go for Middle Eastern? Well, two real reasons. One, Cardassians are largely from a rather arid, deserted planet, and clearly prefer hot climates. So I thought, desert works with them. The other reason, perhaps a bit more controversial, is I see a comparison with, Saddam era Iraq, and certainly in the way they were conducting themselves. I think there was also just a parallel, just in terms of, you think about when those episodes of Next Generation were being made, sort of mid to late 90s, or early to mid 90s, and, that was becoming a thing. And I think anyone who's seen the Battle of Sector 73 Epsilon will know, I'm basically, that's the Battle of 73 Easting, but Star Trek. And that was very deliberate on my part as a comparison. It's just an example of a nations that punch above their own weights, and it kind of goes to their heads. They also become very militarized as a result. So, and then they get trapped in militarism, and I'll talk about that again when we start talking about Battle of the Badlands. The other thing to bring up is, of course, talk about foul play. Now, people were asking about what about intelligence services. So Starfleet intelligence is definitely present. They inform Starfleet routinely about things like the development of Ekor and Kulanor, but intelligence requires people to act on it, and Starfleet and the brass didn't really. They just ignored it for the most part. They didn't think it was significant. With Section 31 or the Obsidian Order, now I think there's definitely things like that at play. I think at this time in history, I think Section 31 was probably involved in certain actions or counteractions trying to bring about reconciliation, because I think they did want to assimilate Cardassia. I use that phrase very deliberately because I think Section 31 in some ways has facilitated the pacification of races that are dangerous. Equally, they may not have considered Cardassia a threat and may have been occupied elsewhere. There was a lot of work they had to do in the Klingon Empire, for example. They were really getting in a fight. There was a whole intelligence war, basically, between, I think, the Tal Shiar and Section 31 for the allegiance of the Klingon Empire. So that's maybe where they were. We can definitely so the Cymbeline Bloodburn, though, almost certainly that is Obsidian Order, as some people have suggested, as a way of disrupting the peace process, and it's very much their style. What really comes across in Starfleet Under Siege is how shaky and how terrified the Cardassian regime is of outside influences, be that break-off states formed from militias in the frontier, or just people experiencing the Federation. And I mentioned that in my Picard theory, is like if people start experiencing the Federation, they might think, that's really dangerous when people experience sort of freer, more liberal systems compared to their own, and systems that seemingly work. So you've got to shut that shit down, right? You've got to get it to cut out. So I think that's perhaps an example of, yes, where definitely the Obsidian Order is at play. And there's other areas, again, mysterious happenings from the destruction of the Tassara back in at the end of Setlik 3 Massacre, which, again, you could probably say was foul play was involved. But that really brings us to the Battle of the Badlands. So, people really liked Battle of the Badlands. Again, it was a more conventional, just straight-up battle episode. But again, we'll talk about the characters coming in and out of play. So, Legat Jazuk and Gul Nasat, they are really the big ones. The Cardassian characters, again, they come from... You think about who their generation are. They'll maybe be Picard's age, maybe a bit younger. But again, they will have experienced what Cardassia was like before the military took over, or before the military really started making changes. Now there's, they kind of have a zeal to it, which is, we know about this whole religion of the state that there is on Cardassia and why it exists. But I also think that the issue with that, and I kind of try to present this, is that while these guys are, driven, and they really believe in what they are doing, and they are so desperate for it. Like, this means way more to them than it does the Federation. And I mean, that's kind of why they quote-unquote won. Just the fact is that they're not the most well-trained. They can't be. And that kind of is a real knock-on. And like I say, I was kind of alluding to that with Damar in DS9. I think we still aren't really seeing very well-trained or educated Cardassian officers, and I think that does hold them back badly. And again, you see that in a lot of regimes that punch above their weight, is that they can't really sustain their officer class, and they generally do get outwitted, or they have to give them the crutches of strong command structure, and that has cons, again, which we'll see in the Battle of Sector 73 Epsilon. I mean, that's kind of, with the Battle of Sector 73 Epsilon, why I made it in between the two, is because I wanted a little bit of a break, and I wanted to cover something else for a little bit. But also, I think it gave me an end point. It's like, this is what's going to be, everything that happens for the Cardassians, every improvement they make, and this is what happens. And it kind of, it's a good little flash forward to say, well, look at, we'll see Cardassians kind of, quite strong and quite successful at the end of this series, but you've already all watched the Battle of Sector 73 Epsilon, so it doesn't last, and it's all just a result of punching above their weight. Now that comes back to the idea of a strong military, and why didn't Starfleet build stronger military ships? When it's like, well, they didn't really need to, for the most part. They're winning quite comfortably, and they don't even need to use their A or even B tier ships, although they do start bringing in the B tier. Certainly by the price of peace, they have to bring in those B tier ships. But most of the time, they're still running off of Mirandas and Excelsiors. Now, this kind of comes into the idea of needing a strong military, was talked about in the comments. And then, does this lead to militancy? Does this lead to a militant civilization? And I think that's a very interesting question, or a militarized society. Now, I'm not American, so I can't comment on America. I can only comment as an outsider, and as an outsider, I think you're all Romans, right? We the Brits are Greek. This was something, was it Anthony Eden or Harold Macmillan said when American GIs were coming over during World War II, and he says, you will regard the Americans as did the Greeks regard the Romans, sort of thing, all sort of strutting about and confident of purpose and everything, but lacking your kind of, sophistication, a certain grace. The Romans are quite, and the Greeks were elegant as well, maybe too elegant, but anyway, I can't really comment on American society with regards to how militant you are or aren't. I can comment on British society, and Britain does have a very strong military. Don't let the detractors deceive you otherwise. Okay, it's not as well funded as I would like, or as I'm sure many Britons who have an enthusiasm for the military would like, but it is good. And Britain has always maintained, the thing with Britain is we've always maintained essentially an expeditionary force. And really, actually, any time we introduced mass conscription, that was almost an anomaly. We always liked to get back to that small professional army very quickly. And what that meant was that we could have a very strong military, fight very well, better than most, without having a highly militarized society. And then, if you want to contrast that with something, you look at Germany or Prussia. So World War I Germany, and it's like how many people were professionals in the military? Maybe not that many. And how kind of sophisticated and drilled was the military? Reasonably, but again, it wasn't huge. But how militarized was the society? Was enormous. The entire society was ready to go onto a war footing just like that. So, and I think that's the thing, is like Starfleet is a strong military. It is, because it has this overwhelming technical advantage, although they don't use, but they aren't a militant society. if you see what I mean. It's a very different approach. So you can have that strong military without being a particularly militant society. There's the theme of the closing tech gap, which I introduced with the Mark IIs. That was actually just a way of explaining why I had the new models for the Ekor and Kulinor, the lovely models made by Rizal 3D. Like I say, check out her page, and if you were interested in seeing those models in games, get in touch with her, because that'd be so awesome to see them in like a mod. I know there's a whole mod for Sins of a Solar Empire. The other thing that brings up is design graphics and battles. Just in terms of people didn't actually seem to raise this, but I just in case people were wondering why I made choices in terms of weapon colors. So Federation is all pretty standard. I went for pink, reddish pink for Cardassian particle weapons, and that was because that's what we see in Next Generation The Wounded. Okay, we'll see gold later, but that's a bit boring, and it does kind of blend with Federation phases a little bit too much for my liking, personally. And I thought it was a way of, changing things up and showing that this is a different era. That's also why I had the yellow torpedoes, although I mixed that a lot later on. So that's the Battle of the Badlands. Now we'll talk about the price of peace. Like I say, re-uploaded if you want to go check it out again. There were some comments on this video that really hit me hard, and I thought I was really happy to see them, because it people really got it, and I was really happy to see that people were really getting it. So someone took a quote, I believe from World War II, I think, and it was, "I want about 1,000 dead so I can sit at the table as a man who has fought." And I believe we have, and the other quote is, "I believe we are establishing peace in our time, and why die for Dorvan?" It was actually Danzig, but they changed it to Dorvan, which was the Native American colony. Anyway, I thought that was just brilliant as a quote, because it really does just nail the perspectives. It is just like the Federation wants this done, it wants it over. It didn't want it to begin with. The big thing is, like, now they have to take it seriously. Like with the introduction of the Galor, that's why I saved it to the last one, is like, now they have to take it seriously. Now the Cardassians are really catching up. They're very close to you, and you do not want another. And I mean, that's the other thing, is like Cardassians, that's why the Cardassians are rearming, because they think you've got this new generation of officers that come up, people like Damar, and Osset, who think we can do it this time. These old codgers, they don't have the learning that we had. They do not have the education that we got in our academies. We have the benefit of learning and knowing better. And we've got the newer ships, and we can this time. And I think that's why there was plans, why the Cardassians were looking to remobilize during the latter half of during the 2370s, really, or latter half of the 2360s, was because it was this new kind of confident generation coming up who thought, we can do better. We're gonna win. We're not just gonna stalemate and win the peace, but we are gonna win the war. And again, that just comes back, doesn't it, to that whole question of what do you mean by victory? What is the meaning of victory? And it's a difficult question to ask, because it's like, Starfleet wasn't beaten, but they lost, or the Federation lost, or they gave it up, and it's like, victory and defeat is a matter of perception. If you look back at French illustrations and plates or engravings during the Napoleonic Wars that were made, sort of contemporary at the time, and they'll have a list of battles that they considered victories, and you've got your soldiers sitting on the bed of victory, as it were. And amongst them, you'll see battles that today we say weren't victories, that were either stalemates or kind of almost defeats. That really just tells you a lot about what perception of victory means. The other thing I'll come to, again, a quote that really hit me, and they said, all of this, because the Cardassians mistook a terraforming colony as a military base. All of this. Over 1 million Cardassian civilians dead, over 100,000 soldiers slain in the field, over 10,000 Federation casualties, somewhere in the region of 20 to 30,000, really. And for what? What did, and that hit me. And I think that goes back to, the message that I was always saying is like, this isn't a jingoistic, war is great series. This is a tragedy. What happened in this? A lot of people died for really not much. And then, the real tragedy, of course, comes from everything. The failures of this piece is just a further tragedy on top of it, because, of course, we know what will happen as a result. Essentially, it kind of lays the groundwork for the Dominion War, and all of that. And people are like, if the Federation didn't have the Prime Directive that stopped them from, getting involved, maybe earlier on, before hostilities broke out, giving the Cardassians aid, industrial replicators, stuff like that, and maybe, they could have brought the Cardassians round. They couldn't because of the Prime Directive. And I mean, that really puts the Prime Directive really square in a lot of people's sights, because it's like, it prevents you from engaging with societies with which you're trying to curry good relations, right? It's like the limits of the Prime Directive aren't like clear, because it's like, okay, they do give the Klingons industrial replicators. That's a whole nother rant on the Prime Directive, but those are really just my thoughts on my Cardassian Border War series. As I've said previously, I'm talking about this from the perspective as another fan, as someone who enjoys these stories and enjoys this content, because I make content that I would watch, and I rewatched the whole series in the lead up to making these 2 videos. So I'd just like to, just ask you again, expand on these ideas maybe in the comments below. Let me know what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? But let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys in the next video.